global Multidão, realizing just transitions. Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP30 in Billy.
Hallo. Hallo, ich freue mich sehr. Oh, sorry, I'm going to switch to English. I'm in the German pavilion, but this event is going to be in English. Welcome to everybody in the audience, and welcome also to everyone in Germany. I'm very excited to be here today. I'm Clara Butz. I'm from the organization Urgewald. And today we're going to talk about fossil fuel expansion in Latin America, some projects that are happening here in the region, and also the role of German financial institutions in there. But it's not just going to be about what is going wrong in the finance world, but also we do have solutions how to get banks and investors out of fossil fuels. So we're going to talk about that as well. And so maybe I'll introduce the whole panel before we start. So right next to me is Heffa Schücking, founder and director of Urgewald. Some of you might know it in Germany. Financial institutions know her very well. We have Ariel Slipak, who is the research coordinator and the head of the Stop Fossil Fuels program at FARN Argentina. And we have Emily Bodgen, who's a research fellow at the Department of Land Economy at the University of Cambridge, working at the intersection of sustainable finance, climate justice, and systems change. Welcome. Thank you for being here. So, we have 3 presentations first, and afterwards we're going to have a small panel discussion and also can take all of your questions. And the first speaker today is going to be Ariel, who is going to speak about fossil fuel expansion in Argentina. So over to you.
Hallo, guten Tag. First of all, I would like to thank the German Pavilion and also Urgewald for this space. My presentation is... Oh, yeah, thank you so much. I would like to thank, as I was saying, the German Pavilion and Urgewald for this space. My name, as Clara said, is Ariel Slipak. I'm the research coordinator of FARN Argentina, which is an NGO with 40 years making advocacy, research, communication, and litigation in Argentina. And as Clara said, I'm the head of our fossil fuel phase-out program, working and engaging communities, making advocacy, our lawyers' litigation on some stuff of fossil fuels, and also advocacy in national and international levels. I think that later than me, Heffa is gonna Heffa will give an overview of the fossil fuel expansion in Latin America. I'm gonna talk about just 2 very concerning projects of midstream in Argentina. But first of all, those projects are in the San Matias Gulf. I'm going to show the area. But to talk about these projects, we need to talk before about Vaca Muerta. You might know that the Vaca Muerta formation, located in 4 provinces or subnational states of Argentina, which are the provinces of La Pampa, sorry, Spanish pronunciation, La Pampa, Rio Negro, Neuquén, and Mendoza, mainly Neuquén. There, Vaca Muerta holds the world's second largest unconventional gas resources and the fourth largest unconventional oil resources. Its large-scale development began in 2013 after a secrecy-shielded agreement between YPF or YPF and Chevron, which generates significant controversy and social conflict with local communities. And this is very polite social conflict, you know, violating of human rights, I might say. Today, in Vaca Muerta, there are multiple operators. YPF is the most important, but there you can find operations from Shell, Chevron, Pan American Energy, which is a joint venture between BP, former British Petroleum, and China National Offshore Oil Corporation, and other Argentinian shareholders. Harbor Energy, which has the assets of Wintershall, sorry for the pronunciation, Tecpetrol, Vista Oil, Plus Petrol, Equinor, and Total. Last year we have the record of unconventional wells drilled, and the impacts on those drills. I would like to say that I often go to Vaca Muerta and see the houses of the people affected by the induced seismicity of the fracking, and it's very shocking. So what we can find is water and air pollution, methane emission, not only as one of the most important gases. Also, as I said before, fracking-related episodes of seismicity, what we call induced seismicity, that prove by recognized academics, and in areas that we never had before, earthquakes, little earthquakes or seismicity. They started with fracking. And of course, the violation of the human rights and indigenous rights of Mapuche people, of Mapuche indigenous communities. So, in order to expand this, Argentina has had last year 300 unconventional vessels, unconventional wells. The plan is to have 1,000 per year, which is incredible. They need to expand export capacity. They have a lack of dispatch capacity, so they are building, or we have in Argentina under evaluation, a lot of gas and oil pipelines. Gas and oil pipelines to Chile, gas and oil pipelines to Bolivia, to Brazil, and some of them to the Argentinian Patagonic coast that I'm going to refer. I'm going to talk about 2 projects, or 3 projects maybe, 2 FLNG projects, or LNG vessels, which have some partner as YPF or YPF, Pampa Energia, Harbor Energy, and Golar from Norway. They are going to install 2 FLNG or 2 LNG vessels that has the capacity to export the 15% of the actually gas production in Argentina. So they're gonna leave Argentina empty of gas even in order to export and re-import gas, because Argentina, when has a lot of demand, there has some months that import gas. So this is not logical economically and environmentally. And they are going to build a gas pipeline to increase exports. And there is another project that involves another European company, which is Eni, which joined this project under Argentina LNG brand in partnership with YPF and Shell, and they want to put even 4 more vessels. This project didn't have a cumulative impact evaluation, and we have documented human rights violation in the process of the public hearing. And United Nations regulators have our information. So, this is the most concerning project. Under the leadership of YPF, 12 companies want to build a 437 kilometers oil pipeline and installed there in Sierra Grande city, where the yellow line ends, a port with 2 monobuoys, and we have proofs of the model of spills, and they put under risk the reproduction of Frank Austral whale. They are putting in risk this beautiful environment with sea wolf, with penguins, dolphins, and touristic cities. And this is the heat map of the whales, Frank Austral whales, and they are installing the vessels and the port in the trajectory of the whales. And in green you can see protected areas. Who are financing? Who are the banks under this project? Well, this project will cost $3 billion, and they are having a $2 billion syndicated loan by those 5 banks: Citibank, Deutsche Bank, Itaú, JP Morgan, Santander, and other 14 banks. What is concerning is that Santander, an European bank, is leading this project with the Deutsche Bank, and we don't have the whole information of this. And also, we have proofs, and as I said before, United Nations regulators on human rights have our information. We have proof that they violated the rights of communities in the public hearing. There was violence and people was hit. So those projects has a lot of reputational risk, and also some multilateral development banks are saying we are not going to finance this. We wrote to from Argentina. We wrote to multilateral development banks and the International Finance Corporation and the Inter-American Development Bank said, no, you're right. This is a nasty project. We are not going to finance that. And also YUCN in the last Congress says that Argentinian authorities should prohibit these projects. So these projects are under litigation, are violating human rights, are violating indigenous rights, and Latin American NGOs and communities are litigating. So, not also an economist as an ecologist, as a former employee of a bank analyzing risk, I should say to any investors, don't put the money here. I should say to Deutsche Bank, to Santander, don't put the money here because you are putting the money in a very risky project. You're going to have an increase of the risk of this project. I think I'm on time or I'm okay. But I just wanted to say that these projects are bad for environmental, but for environment, bad for the economic, Argentinian economics, and they are also bad for investors. That's my message about the fossil fuel expansion in Argentina. So if we want to follow some information on what's happening, you can also have more information on the campaign that we are doing in Argentina in order to create awareness between financial actors, European, Chinese, American, but I think that financial actors should know what's happening and the leisures to human rights on those projects. Thank you very much. Danke.
Thank you, Ariel. Yeah, Deutsche Bank is a hard bank to tackle, a hard bank to move, but we can talk about this later a little bit more. But there is more banks there and also more fossil fuel expansion. And Heffa is going to tell us what we found out in our joint research, in our joint report. And yeah, over to you right away.
Thank you, Clara. I'm still waiting for the presentation to come up. As Clara mentioned, FARN and Conexiones Climáticas from Mexico, Arayara from Brazil, and Amazon Watch from Peru and Ecuador, together with Urgewald, just recently published a report analyzing the frontiers of fossil fuel expansion in Latin America, and also analyzing which financial institutions are behind these projects. So I'm going to try and give you a broad overview. We can see that since the Paris Climate Agreement was negotiated, over 950,000 square kilometers were opened for oil and gas exploration in Latin America and the Caribbean. That is an area larger than Venezuela. If we look at which companies today are responsible for upstream oil and gas expansion, we can see that 46% of the new oil and gas resources which are currently being developed are being developed by companies headquartered, 46% of these resources are being developed by companies headquartered in Latin America. 26% of these resources are being developed by European companies, 16% by North American, and 10% by Asian companies. So we see that over half of the fossil fuel expansion in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's actually being driven by outside actors. But if we look at who are the biggest companies in terms of upstream oil and gas expansion, position number one is taken by Petrobras. Petrobras from Brazil alone is responsible for 29% of the upstream oil and gas resources that are being brought into development. And although we hear a lot from the Lula government on transition, there's no transition map for Petrobras. Petrobras, a matter of fact, is aiming to drill for oil and gas in some of the most ecologically sensitive areas on the continent, in the mouth of the Amazon River Basin. Around 24% of the Great Amazon Reef, a unique coral reef system that was only discovered in 2016, that is still being studied to understand its unique ecology. 24% of this reef have already been designated as oil and gas blocks. And Petrobras is really in the lead here with leading the rush to explore and to extract oil and gas from these sensitive areas. If we look at the Amazon coast, the coral reefs, and also the mangroves along the coast, two ecosystems that are in real danger if it comes to an oil spill, they are responsible for sustaining the food web that supports 420,000 fishers along the coast, a billion-dollar industry that is at risk of being destroyed for 10 or 20 years of oil extraction. And for those who perhaps took part in the march or watched the march on Saturday, one of the main topics, one of the main demands of the over 50,000 protesters were to save the Amazon coast, to save the Amazon forest from oil and gas extraction. What we found most troubling in our report was the amount of fossil fuel infrastructure that is going forward now. And this is so concerning because we're talking about infrastructure that has an operational lifetimes of many decades and would be there and would lock in future upstream oil and gas expansion at a time when we need to be rapidly moving towards net zero. Over 8,800 kilometers of oil and gas pipelines are planned in Latin America. And if you would put those pipes one end to the other, they would reach all the way from Havana to the most southern tip of Chile. 97 million tons per annum of new liquefaction capacity are planned in Latin America and the Caribbean. And just to put this into perspective, This means a 470% increase of LNG export capacity from the region. And most of that export capacity is being developed in Mexico and in Argentina, as we heard. If we look throughout the continent, 54 gigawatts of new gas-fired power capacity are planned. 35 of those gigawatts are planned in Brazil. And the company that is the biggest gas power developer in Brazil is a company called Eneva, which is developing new gas plants, gas liquefaction facilities, and gas fields in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. And it's drawing many protests of the communities who live close to these areas. So who's financing all of this expansion? As Urgewald, this is always a question we have. All of the terrible things you see happening in the world, usually someone is financing part of these developments. So we can see that in terms of bank financing for fossil fuel expansion in the region, 92% comes from outside of Latin America and the Caribbean. Over the past 3 years, banks have channeled almost $139 billion to companies that are driving forward fossil fuel expansion. And Europe carries the most responsibility. 29% of those bank flows come from banks headquartered in Europe. 25% come from banks headquartered in the US, 14% from Canadian banks, 10% from Chinese banks, and 10% from Japanese banks. And if you look at who are the top 5 individual institutions, we have in place one, Santander, with almost $10 billion spent over the past 3 years on fossil fuel expansion companies. And it's a little bit of a surprise because Santander is not the world's biggest bank. It's ranked in terms of its asset size around 18th in global rankings. JP Morgan Chase and Citi, on the other hand, are not such a surprise. They're among the biggest banks in the world. But number 4, Scotiabank, this is a Canadian bank. It's the world's 37th largest bank. There's actually an outsized proportion of Canadian banks in terms of their size, their engagement in Latin America when it comes to fossil fuel expansion. And in 5th position, we have another US bank, Bank of America. Now, if I think of Bank of America, this is a bank that even before the Trump administration came into power, they got rid of the very weak coal exclusion criteria they had. They've actually, since the Glasgow COP, increased their coal financing by 80%. Still, they do not connect the dots. This photo is of one of their offices that burnt down during the California wildfires beginning of the year. They do not connect the dots between their own investments, their own financing, and these kinds of climate-related disasters. This is a bank that is oblivious and really, you know, I mean, they're acting as if they're based on a different planet and climate change is not a reality. On the other hand, you have banks like Santander who talk a good green game and actually are financing more renewables than they are financing fossil fuels. But at the same time, every new fossil fuel infrastructure deal that comes up in Latin America, Santander is there to help arrange it and to help bring it on the way. And this is just to say it's not enough to invest in renewables if you continue also financing the other team. This will not get us where we have to be. And then there's Deutsche Bank. In our ranking, Deutsche Bank is ranked number 12 when it comes to financing of fossil fuel expansion in Latin America. If we look overall at Deutsche Bank's portfolio, we can see they're spending twice as much on fossil fuels as on renewables. This is on a global level. But if we look at specific deals, we can see that Deutsche Bank and Santander, as well as Citigroup and Itaú, and actually JP Morgan Chase, that they're often the key banks that are bringing together the consortia for corporate loans, for project finance loans, or are the key book runners for bond issues. This is a bond issue from last September for Petrobras, at a time when it was already clear that Petrobras's expansion will be taking place on the Amazon coast. This did not stop Deutsche Bank, Santander, any of these banks from channeling $2 billion to Petrobras, which supports its plans. More and more activist, indigenous organizations, civil society organizations are beginning to focus on the finance, because it's clear that if financing goes on as it is, then temperatures will keep on rising. Finance has an incredible responsibility when it comes to enabling new fossil fuel infrastructure. And unless we bring finance in line with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, we're looking at a really bad future for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heffa, for these clear words. So we've seen what is going on in Latin America, and this is going on globally as well, as we all know who are here. And often it's the case that it's like, yeah, but you're only talking about fossil fuels, and what about, how do we get out of them? What are the solutions? What can we actually do? And how, well, which financial instruments do we have to get rid of them, kind of? And the University of Cambridge did some very interesting research on this, where they found out what we can do and how we can do it, and they took action right away. And so that's what Emily is going to tell us more about, and I'm very excited to hear about that. So right over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily. I'm a departmental fellow at Finance for Systemic Change, which is a research center at the University of Cambridge. Thank you so much for your super interesting presentations. And yeah, I'm here to introduce an academic framework that we've tried to pull together that builds on some of these findings and focuses on ending institutional finance for fossil fuel expansion. And this has been a real collaboration with Urgewald and their excellent databases on coal, oil, and gas expansion, G-Cell and Gogel. I really recommend you check them out. So I think we've been hearing more and more about how we may have only 3 or 4 years before we exhaust a 1.5 degree carbon budget. And that it's becoming clearer that there's no room for new fossil fuels, and not only that, but we'll also have to close down many existing projects before the end of their economic life. And I think, yeah, one of the messages I've been hearing strongly from the protesters too is that this isn't a future climate issue, but it's also an issue of safeguarding livelihoods and critical ecosystems and knowledge systems as well right now. So yeah, I think in our previous work, we've been focusing a lot on fossil fuel companies themselves, but as both of my colleagues have illustrated so well, it's also, it's not necessarily halting the expansion that those companies are planning. And yeah, we did some academic research that looked at what can be done differently. And based on that research, we think there are 2 key gaps. Firstly, thank you. Firstly, we need to really look at the finance of where that's facilitating these projects. And secondly, we need to look at the kind of metrics that we're using to measure corporate climate performance. So on the finance side, yeah, we see that as you can see from the chart, that 90% of new finance for fossil fuel expansion is actually coming from debt. So that's, and when I say debt, I mean bank loans and debt issuances. And banks are playing a really, really critical role here, because they're not only the issuers of bonds of loans, but they also underwrite bonds. And yet somehow they're often excluded from corporate climate methodologies and kind of initiatives. So we really need to bring that focus back onto debt and these guys have illustrated really well the kind of the focus that we need to take. And then I think on the metric side, we often don't focus on what companies are actually doing, but instead we focus on pledges and targets, and often long into the future. And we found that doesn't actually correlate very well with actual climate action from companies. And often these metrics that we're using don't actually reference fossil fuels at all. So I think we really need to make changes on both of those fronts. So I've been leading on the development of an academic framework that tries to address both of those issues. It's really trying to bring that focus on debt for fossil fuels and fossil fuel expansion. And we've developed a set of criteria focusing on 4 key sectors, and you'll obviously see energy companies and utilities often in the mix as the supply and demand anchors of the industry, but we've also included banks and insurers as financiers and underwriters that make such expansion possible. We focus on banks in their role both as issuers of loans and as underwriters of debt issuances. On the kind of metric side, we place a big emphasis on real company action, so what are companies actually doing, rather than past performance or future targets. And to comply with the framework, companies must not be conducting, financing, or facilitating any fossil fuel expansion. They also must be phasing out existing extraction and infrastructure. So for coal companies, they must be planning to exit the sector completely by 2030. And that's for OECD countries, and for non-OECD countries by 2040. And then for oil and gas companies, they must be phasing out extraction at a minimum rate of 3% per year. For future iterations of the framework, we're really keen to integrate a criterion on anti-climate lobbying. This is a really important piece of the puzzle. But we were struggling with the data sources for that criterion. And we're also hoping to ramp up the phase-out rate for existing oil and gas extraction. So what's the point of all this? It has 2 potential kind of buckets of applications. We're hoping it can be a general framework for the field to use as a sort of way of measuring actual climate action by companies on fossil fuel expansion and phase-out. And it also has practical investment applications. So currently Bloomberg is developing a corporate bond index based on this methodology, and we're providing advisory implementation input. And that will be a real tool for people to use to decarbonize their portfolios in a meaningful way and actually get at the debt finance source of fossil fuel expansion. The implementation process of that has been really fascinating. Has also proved how challenging it can be to kind of implement some of these data sources in action. So it's been a real learning curve, and I'm really excited about the next steps. Finally, just to follow up, the research paper which outlines the framework will be available in due course, but if you wanted to look at something already in print that sets out the research behind the framework, you can look at my colleague, Professor Ellen Quigley's paper on evidence-based climate impact. And please do reach out by email or after the panel, because we're really hoping this is a collaborative, iterative process, and we're always keen for feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emily, and thank you to all our panelists. I'm going to open the floor for questions now, but before you, you can think of all your questions already, but I will start with some right away, because we've heard now so many different things, and we're in the German Pavilion. So what I really want to know is, what are the implications for German institutions, for German pension funds, for Deutsche Bank? And I will open it to all of you.
I mean, we have some actors in Germany, some financial actors who are much more progressive than Deutsche Bank. If I think of the German insurance sector, for example, Germany's largest insurance companies, Allianz, Munich Re, Hanover Re, Talanx, they realize that climate change is real. And they have adopted policies to, for example, exclude insurance for all new upstream oil and gas development. That's definitely a good step. Some of them have even taken another step, which is to exclude midstream oil infrastructure, so oil pipelines. Their policies aren't perfect because they're not strong enough yet on gas. But still, you can see that they are beginning to restrict both their insurance and their investments in the fossil fuel industry. Or if we look at the coal industry, they're already excluded. If I think back of what Allianz's portfolio looked like before 2015 in terms of its exposure to the thermal coal industry, and I look today, it's radically different. 75% of those investments are out there, and Allianz is, over time, ratcheting closer and closer to zero, to wanting to achieve zero coal in its portfolio. Now, my question to some of these more progressive German financial institutions would be, why are you still buying bonds of Deutsche Bank, Santander, JP Morgan Chase? This is very much at odds of what you're trying to achieve with your own climate policies. I think there's a real split within the finance industry, and it's important that long-term progressive investors, pension funds, insurance companies realize they cannot just go on investing in the part of the finance industry that is dragging us all down.
My reflection on this topic is very similar than Heffa's because living in a Latin America country in South America, what I got noticed is that some financial actors have, as Heffa said, a more progressive criteria, and they are not climate change denialists, and they have a climate approach. But my message is that is not enough. We are not living a climate crisis. We are living an ecological crisis and a crisis of our way of living. The world is bad organizing their production, extraction, production, consumption. I remember from the pandemic time, 2021, I saw a photograph of a compost of pear extracted in Argentina, processed in Thailand, and consumed in California. The trip that compost made is annoying. So we are living a climate crisis because of that, because we are organizing our economies with an only profit criteria and not energetic and water, and we don't calculate energy and water virtual consumptions. So my message to financial institutions, don't worry, I remember, my message is that you don't, to banks and insurance company, you not only need a climatic criteria, you need a criteria that take into consideration biodiversity, human rights violations, indigenous rights violations. So the zone of exclusion, so the exclusions criteria should be increased and not only be net zero. Sometimes also the leisures to the environment are not only climatic. We are here talking about fossil fuels, but in my country, the so-called green investment includes big dams that are damaging glaciers, and also include lithium extraction that empty a whole river and are displacing communities. So my message to any financial institutions is that we should increase our restriction criteria, not only to net zero, we should include biodiversity, human rights, and indigenous rights. And specifically to German institutions, the last decades, German institutions had a tradition of listening and a very interesting human rights approach. So don't go after this new wave of fashion of climate denialism. Don't import Argentinians' new ideologies, for example, and sustain the European traditions of respecting human rights and go for peace. So financial institutions can open, for example, windows to receive messages directly from indigenous communities. I work in an NGO, and sometimes I feel tired of sending messages to financial institutions from Mapuche's communities. Let's speak directly with Mapuche's communities. If you are putting money in such a huge project, in one of the biggest projects of your life, you can go to the ground and speak directly with people affected by fracking and people affected it's a minimum cost. So open a window to hear directly the impacts of the project, and that's all, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I really echo everything that was said. I think I'd add in relation to this particular project that this is an invitation to recognize how to create more impact in terms of the true sources of new finance for fossil fuels. And my invitation to German financial institutions would be, where you have a very ambitious policy on equity, please try and also look at your sources of debt. And I think that way perhaps have a more sort of serious impact on the finance that is enabling fossil fuel expansion.
All right, are there any questions in the audience? Great. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Nikki Hutley. I work with a think tank and advocacy group, Climate Council in Australia. So my question is, and it's something I'm thinking about all the time, and thank you, the great presentations. We in Australia are doing similar things. You might have just seen the North West Shelf expansion that's been approved by our government, another 70 years of gas bombing. But finance is not necessarily a single solution. And I know when I sort of keep asking the minister, why do you keep approving these mines in the first place? My question is, there is a question here, is do we not need more angles to think about than just the finance? Because there's a point at which, unless you have carbon pricing or really strict environmental protection laws, you're just going to get people financing it because they're chasing the money, especially for the pension funds and things like that. So where would you see other angles to support the finance angle, I guess?
Maybe just to give a direct answer, I would agree with you that to really stop fossil fuel expansion, just focusing on finance is not enough. We basically need to use our entire toolbox. This means community opposition. This means influencing public opinion. This means diplomatic negotiations, advocacy, but it means legal challenges. All of these things. The thing about finance is, if I look at Germany, Germany has a long tradition of having a strong coal industry, and where people from the coal industry, there was a revolving door between the coal industry and government, and coal companies had an enormous influence, which made it quite hard to get the government to take more progressive decisions. If I looked at who moved first in Germany. I mean, in 2015, we had one of the world's largest coal divestments by Allianz, by an insurance company, by a financial actor that was ahead of the government. This helped create different conditions, parts of the finance industry beginning to draw back from coal. It's an important part of the discussion. And if you think about finance in a way, it can be neutral. I mean, finance, you can profit from supporting green circular economy companies, or you can profit from supporting fossil fuel companies. And I kind of feel it just takes everything. And the COPs in themselves, government-to-government negotiations, it's very clear to us who have visited COPs over the past decades that it really takes much more power, and money is a source of power that we are trying to take away from the fossil fuel industry.
Thank you, Heffa. And okay, there's another question in the audience. I'm gonna come. Yes, thank you.
Hello, Larry Moffat from the Press Club, Brussels, Europe. Just a quick comment about Santander before I ask my question. It's not only one of the biggest investors in Latin America, but globally, according to the Banking on Climate Chaos report, it's in the top 25. And within the EU, it's at the very top, along with Deutsche Bank and BNP Paribas. Now, my question is about the fact that 90% of the money provided by the banks is in the form of debt, as you said. Does that mean that the banks are basically saying, we're not going to invest our money in your stranded assets, but we will help you find short-sighted customers who will buy your bonds?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting angle. And I think, sadly, what we see in a lot of climate methodologies is that that particular aspect is often excluded from the methodology. So, yeah, we really are keen that we take a holistic view of banks and start including not just their loans, but also their underwriting role as well.
Thank you so much. This is really, really interesting. My name's Beth. I'm a US-based attorney, and I'm just curious if any of you would like to say a little bit more about the teeter-totter of incentives that we're talking about here. Heffa mentioned a couple of companies or banks that had chosen to take a human rights-based approach. You were mentioning, Ariel, incorporating standards on biodiversity protection, ecological protection. You're mentioning trying to get companies to move away from debt financing. So what have you seen that has begun to shift that incentive from a profit motive to a more holistic motive? And I'm asking, as a US citizen and someone where I know that a lot of our legal systems really drive this adherence to a notion of fiduciary duty and shareholder profit that really is tied to what the previous questioner said about pension systems. So it's a massive teeter-totter, but what are you seeing that really motivates that shift toward a different type of incentive?
I mean, if I think about Urgewald's own experience, then I would say there are sort of three things that lead financial institutions to shift their approach and to begin excluding or restricting their support for the fossil fuel industry. And that's number one, an enlightened leadership that realizes that climate change is real. I mean, I often laugh when I see that in Europe, the European Central Bank is doing like climate stress testing for individual financial institutions. They should just do a short quiz with the different European bank CEOs, what they know about the climate crisis. Then you would very quickly also realize where the problem is. Many of these institutions assume that they can keep on doing their business just as well, some even better, under a 3-degree scenario, and talk about the incredible air conditioning investment possibilities or what have you. No, it's really sad. There's a complete underestimate of what continued investments in fossil fuels will mean for our economy at large, for our societies at large, and for preserving the narrow corridor of temperature that human life on the planet depends on. So, enlightened leadership. Number 2 is reputational risk. For most financial institutions, it is really important. This is quite different. The oil and gas companies, Total Energy, Shell, they don't care how they're perceived. But financial institutions do. Their business relies on trust. And this is a very important lever for civil society organizations to have influence. Number 3 is fear of regulation. And there's a very promising sort of development in Europe that we see, especially within the EU, that more and more national regulators and financial supervisory authorities are beginning to look at the exposure of financial institutions in their jurisdiction to the fossil fuel industry. We have, for example, the French financial supervisors who every year produce a report looking specifically at the investments of French financial institutions. And although this is just monitoring, this already has really a big influence when regulators, financial supervisors are beginning to pay attention. So those are kind of 3 levers that I would say that change is coming from, but I'm fascinated with what Emily was talking about, because this is like a markets-based approach. Because part of the problem is many people are invested in fossil fuels without wanting to be invested in the expansion of this industry. And it's simply because so much of investment today is passive investment, and where funds are investing against an index which usually covers all sectors and there's no real exclusion. The framework that Emily was talking about finally offers an opportunity for passive investors to say, we don't want to support the further expansion of the fossil fuel industry. And up to now, that doesn't exist. When financial products exist that make this possible, like, this can also be a real game changer.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I will just build on that a little bit to say that there is a very different role in the system between asset owners, asset managers, and other financial actors, and they have different fiduciary responsibilities. Asset owners in particular are a really good leverage point. They have a really long-term time horizon in the sense of like institutional investors like pension funds and insurance companies. They have a kind of fiduciary responsibility to think about the holistic, as you say, well-being of their finance. And I think that offers a really interesting entry point, and that's kind of where the project for the index came from, is looking at asset owners, as you say, who want to do better. Maybe they actually have a legal responsibility to do better. I think that legal battle is playing out live, but and different regional kind of obligations there. But that's a kind of movement around that idea has been really developed by my colleague Ellen, who I mentioned, under the name universal ownership. So it's this idea that actually the majority of your wealth as an investor comes from the health of the economy overall. And so if you have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize profit, you actually have a fiduciary responsibility to end your investments in things that destabilize the whole health of the economy, such as fossil fuels. So yeah, I think that's another way, instead of thinking of finance as one monolith, thinking of the different financial actors and the different incentives they have, and using that as leverage. And as asset owners are also kind of the owners of the system, there's a kind of interesting entry point there.
Just would like to add that I find a lot of connections between the 2 questions, because just from our experience of what we are doing, we work on making advocacy on financial actors, because we find it as another strategy, but we work with communities, go to the ground, and work in coordination with academics from biologists, engineering, that making science and proving the impacts of how fossil fuels, for example, hurt, and also try to scale up that and disseminate that reality, because it's very difficult. I work in an NGO that I think that we might have in our budget a little fraction of a second of profits of one of the 12 Vaca Muerta operators, and also our own our own government, our state is spying us, as shown by documents shown by journalists. So, in this difficult context, I think that a really big fight is for more transparency. There are tools and spaces that should be occupied by civil society, as Heffa said. For example, in Latin America, we have the Escazú Agreement. I don't know if you have knowledge about the Escazú Agreement. It's an agreement signed by most of the countries on information and also to defend environmental defensors, because we are in the statistics, we are the first country with killings of environmental defensors. So, in this difficult context, advocacy through financial actors is just one strategy, and through litigation we fight for a more restrictive laws, but there is a lack. For example, we made requests of information of methane emissions in Argentina, and the government says we don't know. So they don't have just little things that we don't have an air quality station in Neuquén where it's fracking, and we have satellite images of thermic anomalies, and we ask that, hey, you're the government, tell me what's happening here. There are thermic anomalies. What's that cloud? It's methane that is killing people, and we don't know. And there's a secrecy because you are asking for information that could make troubles to private investors. So this is a secrecy. So we should fight with information, communication, and with that we can generate those reputational risks that have an impact on their profit, because that is their care. So I don't think that Santander cares about the oceans. I think that the caring about the oceans give money to Santander, or to show that they have an oceans program, give money to them, but I don't think that they care the oceans. If they care the oceans, they're not going to finance an oil pipeline. So it's important to increase communications and the fight for against this lack of transparency in every country in order to create this reputational risk.
Thank you very much, Ariel. We have time for one more question from the audience. Yes.
Jens Walter. Can you hear me? Jens Walterman of Plant for the Planet. In the summer, we had a landmark decision by the International Court of Justice advisory opinion. So my question goes to you, back to the legal trajectory. So to say, we've heard about other market trajectories or community and information campaign-based trajectories, but on the legal trajectory, do you see that having a significant impact on your work, maybe most directly to you, Heffa, to use that advisory opinion in informing some of the legal approaches that you're taking vis-a-vis banks, their regulatory requirements? Is there real progress that we can expect from this decision?
I mean, I'm not really a legal expert, right? Urgewald, we focus on finance, but I'm very excited about a new legal case brought forward in Canada, and this is against the Canada pension plan, which from my understanding, is set up so that every Canadian citizen, you're automatically, basically, a member of this pension plan. And young people, young Canadians, are taking the Canada Pension Plan to court. Now, one thing you have to realize about the Canada Pension Plan, they're directly also invested in fossil fuel infrastructure. And so this case is interesting because they are basically making the argument that the investments of the Canada Pension Plan, the investments they're making today, will ruin pensions for future generations. And are putting, if you look at a typical pension fund, I don't know what the case is for the Canada Pension Plan, but usually maybe around up to 5% of the investments will be in the old energy world. But these 5% of investments endanger the other 95%, right? They're taking the pension fund itself to court, but also basically the investment consultants. So from my understanding, pension funds, they define something like an investment belief. And the investment consultants of the Canada Pension Plan, they have basically been saying 3-degree world is not a problem. This won't have an impact on the pensions. And there are many other, court cases are always different from one jurisdiction to the next. There are many other facets of this, but I find this, very encouraging that really financial institutions are being, challenged according to their long-term obligations. And I think it's a case that many asset owners throughout the world are going to follow to see what comes out of this.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the questions. Thank you to our amazing panelists for speaking. I'm sure that all of us will stay on on getting rid of fossil fuels on that task. We hope that all of you will do the same. We do have a few press releases with us about the report that Heffa presented. And also keep looking out for the new study that Cambridge University, that Emily is going to put out. So thank you very much for coming, and see you soon.
Global Muchidão, realizing just transitions. Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP30 in Billey.